This is election 2018, the race for New Mexico's Secretary of State. I'm Fred Martino. In partnership with the League of Women Voters of Greater Las Cruces, we invited the candidates to join us for this forum. They will each have 90 seconds to respond to each question and should not mention their opponent in the answer. The candidates include incumbent Democrat Maggie Toulouse Oliver, Republican Gavin Clarkson, and Libertarian Ginger Grider. Thank you all for being with us for this program.
Thank you for having us.
And we also want to thank Gwen Hansen from the League of Women Voters of Greater Las Cruces. She has our first question.
And our first question goes to Ms. Oliver. Ms. Oliver, do you support any changes in New Mexico's voting procedures? And if so, what changes?
Well, for the last 2 years as Secretary of State and in the 10 years that I served as Bernalillo County Clerk, running elections in the largest county in the state, I always felt that it was very important to continue to make sure that voters had access to the ballot box and that we were continuing to make it easier, not harder, for voters to cast a ballot while at the same time keeping our elections secure. So in future legislative sessions, I plan to advocate for things like open primaries, which will encourage participation of those who aren't registered with a major party to be able to have their say in a primary election. We'll be looking at potentially things like same-day voter registration, which can help address issues for voters who, for whatever reason, weren't able to get registered by the 28-day deadline, which we still have here in New Mexico, but a lot of other states have moved away from. I'm looking at things potentially like vote-at-home initiatives here in New Mexico. The state of Colorado has done a wonderful thing where every single voter in the state gets a ballot in the mail every election, and they choose how they return it, either at a secure drop box or at a polling location or by mail. There's lots that we can do to continue expanding access to the ballot box, and that's what I want to continue working on. At the same time, we do need to continue to make sure our elections are safe and secure. So as Secretary of State, I will continue to do the work that I have started, making sure that our election systems are safe and protected, and that we're using all the tools and resources available, not only provided by the state, but from the federal government in order to ensure that moving forward.
Thank you. Dr. Clarkson, same question. Would you like for me to repeat it?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Do you support any changes in New Mexico's voting procedures? If so, what changes?
Yes, I do. One of the things that is critically important is that we return faith in the fairness of our elections. Unfortunately, there's been far too much partisanship in our elections, far too much partisanship in the people administering our elections. And many people believe that elections are not fair. They believe that they're rigged. And we unfortunately are having people implement changes or doing things that cause us to lose faith in the election. So we need to do things that restore the voters' faith that when they cast their ballot, it's being treated fairly and honorably. And that's one. So the things that I would look to do, first of all, is I would make sure that everybody understands the role of the Secretary of State is not to make law, is to enforce the existing law. So the only changes that I would be advocating are those that the legislature has empowered me to do. We've had a big problem with secretaries of state in the past going beyond the scope of the authority granted by the legislature. And in fact, we just had a Supreme Court case this past week that said that if the legislature doesn't give the secretary authority, he or she doesn't have that authority. And so the things that I want to do would be make sure that we don't need to have straight party voting. And the Supreme Court agreed until the legislature decides. So the things that would be within my power would be things to make sure that every citizen has the ability to vote as easily as possible, but we make sure that non-citizens, those people who aren't supposed to be voting, those people shouldn't be casting ballots. But I am absolutely, every time we have a non-citizen voting, it suppresses the power of a citizen's vote, and I am totally against voter suppression.
Thank you. Ms. Grider.
Yes, ma'am. So, in my travels across New Mexico, I have been speaking to lots of citizens and asking them why do they vote, and if they do or do not, why? And a lot of things that Dr. Clarkson alluded to, lack of faith in the elections. And I was recently had the pleasure of being able to attend the recount of our Libertarian governor candidate when he didn't get enough write-ins, and was able to observe the election process, and I can tell you that it was so impressive. Albuquerque was, that's where the district that I attended the recount at, and it was so impressive, the security and the just professionalism and wonderful system that the Secretary of State's office has in place. And so for voter security, I would just say that I have no fears there. Amazing job that they did up there, and that, you know, having faith in our elections is the most important part. Working on voter apathy, which is not great here. You know, I mean, we don't have a lot of confidence in the elections as New Mexicans, I've found. And so using education, explaining to the citizenry where government intersects with their lives, what the Secretary of State's office does, because so many people think that the Secretary of State brings coffee to the governor, and I've had people tell me that. And so education on where does government intersect with our lives, how does that help, you know, where can you get involved with the process.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Clarkson, we'll begin with you on question number 2, and I want to let the candidates know and also our viewers at home know that some of the issues that we cover are sometimes mentioned in responses to other questions. So we will still ask the question, giving all candidates a chance to address issues. This issue was already brought up by one of the candidates, but we want to again allow everyone to talk about it. And Dr. Clarkson, we begin with you. Do you support open primaries, yes or no, and explain?
Well, I think there are arguments both for and against open primaries, but the role of the Secretary of State is to implement the law as passed by the legislature. So it actually doesn't matter what my personal position is on open primaries. If the legislature asks me to come up with a policy position on open primaries, with my staff, I will do the analysis, I will make the arguments both for it and against it. But again, my position is that the Secretary of State's role is not to make law. The Secretary of State's role is to enforce the existing law. And unfortunately, we've had too much problem with that in the past, and that's something that needs to stop. And fortunately, the Supreme Court gave a very, very clear answer. The Secretary of State does not get to make any law. They don't get to do anything that the legislature hasn't done or hasn't given the authority to do. So while your question's a very valid question, and there's lots of arguments on both sides about open primaries, and there are some people who can make arguments for it and some people make arguments against it, my role is not to decide that. My role is to implement the law as passed by the legislature, and that's what I will do as Secretary of State.
Ms. Grider, your position on this open primaries?
My position is just almost mirrored of Mr. Clarkson's. You stole my answer, Gavin.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. I feel very much the same way. I feel like it is an administrative position, and then in no shape, form, or fashion should the office ever be used for partisanship or trading favors or anything, nor should any government office, absolutely, but that this is the gatehouse to the most precious thing that we have, and that is the ability of the citizenry to access its representative government, and that government should be allowed, the citizens should be able to instruct the government in how we want it to be run, that it not happen to us, but that we instruct our government like it was originally intended. Government should not be a thing that happens to the citizens or at them, but one that they are involved deeply in, and they instruct the government and the state of New Mexico. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver, you've expressed support for open primaries. If you could talk about that.
Absolutely, I do support open primaries, and I view my role as the Secretary of State as one of an advocacy role to provide expertise and information to the legislature when they consider this decision. And that expertise comes from years of administering elections, again in Bernalillo County, the largest county in the state, in which I saw primary election after primary election in which voters came to the polls, went out of their way, took the time out of their day to show up and cast a ballot in a primary election, and either they found that they weren't a registered voter, weren't registered with a major party, or that they thought they were registered with a major party, and for whatever reason the voter rolls did not reflect that, and were either turned away from the polls or had to cast a provisional ballot that wasn't counted. In every primary election around the state, we have literally thousands of provisional ballots that go uncounted from people who want to have their voice heard at the polls, who want to express that opinion. In many primary elections throughout the state, the primary election is the general election, because we have a number of districts around the state in which we don't have a major party opponent running running in the general. And so that's the last stop. That's the last opportunity for a voter to have their say in what will ultimately be the outcome of an election. And so for me to allow those folks who are showing up, who are taking the time out of their day to get their voice heard at the polls, and who are not already registered with a major party, we should open up the process to allow them to do that. It will enhance participation in our elections and enhance our democracy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Greider, yours is the third question. How would you increase voter registration, especially among groups such as Latinos, young people, and convicted felons?
Yes, thank you very much for that question, because it's something that's very near and dear to me. Education, education, and education. Again, explaining to the citizenry in whatever way. So if that would be someone that does not speak English as their first language, it would be provided in their native language. And to explain how to become involved in the process, why voting is so important, what each office does. Because just like the Secretary of State's office, most people have no idea what each individual office does, who they represent, who they should go to. Is this a federal level issue that you're having? Is it a state? Is it county? Is it local? And who should handle it? And what these offices do and how they impact their lives. And continuing to just provide that as much as humanly possible. I don't believe we can ever become educated enough. We're always having an election of some sort. There's always one coming up. I mean, in the world of politics, we're always getting ready. Everybody wants to know what's happening in 2020 already. So I would use it as an education platform continually.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver.
I believe voter education is absolutely critical, and that's why I've asked the legislature in the budget for the 2019 session to provide funding for my office to do a major voter education program, because we have a big change coming up next year, and that we will be conducting local elections on one day, the second Tuesday after the first Monday in November, or the first Monday after, yeah. The same day as the general election in odd-numbered years. And this is going to be a big change because most folks are used to having elections occurring at different times throughout the calendar year. And so we are asking the legislature for funds to do that kind of education work. It goes beyond providing the information, though. Making sure that voters have trust in our system and faith in our system is important, which is why I've been so focused on election security over the last 2 years, since we found out that Russia attempted to interfere in our elections in 2016. So making sure that voters know that we are taking every step possible to protect the election process and that their votes will be counted as cast, which is why I've been a huge advocate in the past and continue to advocate for our post-election audit system here in New Mexico. And finally, I have worked and put together a Native American voting task force, which is made up of tribal members from around the state working within their communities to advise my office as to how better provide information and resources to our tribal communities. And in fact, we're getting ready to put out a voter guide with the partnership of the League of Women Voters that addresses a lot of that information within those communities. So I'm very excited about that as well.
Thank you. Dr. Clarkson.
Well, yes, we absolutely need to increase voter participation among our citizens. And as somebody who is an enrolled tribal member, I want to make sure that every Native vote counts, including mine. My father was a 26-year Navy veteran and was the first American Indian to fly a jet. And he fought against tyranny and for our freedoms to make sure that we have that right to vote. One of the things that we also need to do to increase voter participation is to let people know that their votes actually count. And that is something where we've had a complete failure here in New Mexico. There are countless errors on the voter rolls. We have, there's been some discussion about Bernalillo County. In Bernalillo County itself, at the moment, we have dead people registered to vote. We have non-citizens who have cast votes in the past. And apparently somebody even registered a dog to vote once. And so these are things where I'm a former computer science professor. I have a background in cybersecurity, and I absolutely agree that security of our voting machines is an important thing. But it's important for the listeners, for the viewers to know, hack-proof is not the same thing as fraud-proof. And unfortunately, and a lot of times people talk about voter fraud in partisan areas, but a lot, as was mentioned earlier, sometimes the primary decides the election. And a lot of the voter fraud is not based on partisan issues, it's just garden variety corruption. And so that is something that if we can have clean voter rolls where we have citizens voting and we don't have non-citizens voting, we don't have zombies voting, we make sure that people are voting where they're actually a resident, that is something that will help people feel like their vote really matters. And that's a critical function of the Secretary of State.
Thank you.
Okay, our last question dealt with increasing voter registration. That's only half the battle. You also have to get folks to get out there to the polls and vote. And Ms. Oliver, we'll begin with you on this question. How would you increase voter turnout?
There's always a debate about whether it's the role of the Secretary of State or county clerks to increase voter turnout. And my personal belief is that when we have increased voter participation, we have more robust participation in our democracy, and that is reflected by the leaders that we elect. So I view my role as Secretary of State in terms of enhancing voter participation wherever we can. So that's why I have advocated for policies that do just that and have been demonstrated to do just that, not only here in New Mexico, but across the country. I am an advocate for open primaries, as has been previously discussed. I'm an advocate for same-day voter registration for the same reason. Often we have voters who have newly moved to the state or who have just become interested in the election really close to Election Day, or perhaps they've even moved within the state and they've updated their mailing address and driver's license, but they forgot to get that voter registration form in. These are the voters that show up to the polls on Election Day and have to cast a provisional ballot, so they are unable to have their vote counted. And this is truly unfortunate because, again, we're losing out on thousands of votes every single election when we could just make an administrative fix using the technology that we have in place to be able to accommodate these voters moving forward. So these are just a few of the ideas that I have, but of course I will also continue to work in partnership with our nonpartisan advocacy organizations such as the League of Women Voters, such as the Native American Voter Alliance, to do as much voter education and outreach as possible as well.
Okay, Dr. Clarkson.
Well, once again, we'll return to the theme. One of the things we need to have is people have faith that their vote matters. And so one of the things we need to do is make people comfortable that when they go to the ballot and vote, the power of their vote has not been suppressed by fraud, by various different things that make it so that their vote doesn't count. We have people who follow the rules. We have hundreds of thousands of legal immigrants who follow the rules. Many of them spent years going through that process. And one of the things that they look forward to is having their vote count. And then they see that somebody else was able to cheat the system and have their vote all of a sudden disappear. If you have zombies, aliens, and canines eligible to vote, how are you as a human supposed to have your vote actually matter? Now, the other thing is that voter participation clearly goes down on down ballot races when you have straight party voting. And fortunately, the Supreme Court said that straight party voting is not the law. And so I filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, and they agreed with me 5-0 unanimously. And it was a bipartisan decision. Republicans and Democrats and independents on the court all said that the Secretary of State should not be rigging elections by making changes at the last minute to try and get a partisan advantage. Instead, the Secretary of State's job is to follow the law and enforce the law only as given to it by the legislature, because the Constitution says that the legislature has the power over elections, and the Secretary of State shall not make law. They're only supposed to enforce the law.
Mrs. Greider.
Could you repeat the question again, please?
Yes,
for
absolutely.
Me? Thank you.
How would you increase voter turnout if elected Secretary of State?
I believe that it would be beneficial to work with the voter groups that are currently in the state, voter advocacy groups, and listen to their views and opinions. They spend a lot of time and energy on this very subject, and I believe that their input is invaluable, such as the League of Women Voters, and there are others out there, and to reap that knowledge base and get the voice of all of the New Mexicans who are interested in this topic and form my opinion from there.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Clarkson.
Yes, ma'am.
Question 5 for you. Are you in favor of same-day voter registration? Why or why not?
Yes, I'm in favor of same-day voter registration, so long as when you are showing up for that same-day voter registration, you can demonstrate that you are a resident and that you are a citizen. I think we should make it easy for every citizen to vote. My issue is trying to make sure that we keep non-citizens or those who are ineligible to vote from voting. Because that is something, this is one thing, and this has become a partisan issue in the past. There are some people say that there's no problem, there's other people say there's all sorts of problems. But from my perspective, it's a knowable situation. We ought to be able to know right now, with our existing technology systems, how many dead people we have on the rolls. That's a very simple question. It's just a process of matching databases. That's it. That we ought to be able to restore faith among the electorate. So I have no problem with same-day voter registration as long as citizens are showing up with proof of residency, proof of citizenship. And I would be as comfortable if we need to get to the point, because I don't want people to say, oh gee, that having a valid ID to prove your citizenship is too expensive. As Secretary of State, if there is a mechanism to do so, I would want to provide free voter IDs to citizens. Many other countries do this, where they have vote IDs just for citizens so that they can vote in the election. I want to make sure it is very easy for citizens to vote. Those who are eligible to vote should have an easy path to the ballot box to cast their ballot. Those who are not eligible should not be voting. And as soon as we can get to that, and again, I'll do the studies in the Secretary of State's office, and I'll release the data one way or another, whatever the data shows, but I want to make it very clear. I am against voter suppression in any form, and I am for as much access for citizens to vote as possible.
Thank you. Ms. Greider.
Well, again, Mr. Clarkson.
Sorry.
We tend to align quite a bit. So yes, I'm not as concerned with the non-citizens voting as Mr. Clarkson is, but because I just attended the recount and was so impressed with the security. I mean, just wonderful. And I think that's about it.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver.
I'm very much in favor of same-day voter registration. I have been for quite a while. A few years ago, when I was a county clerk, my fellow county clerks and I supported a bill that would have allowed for same-day voter registration at early voting locations. I'm willing to work together with the clerks again this next year to find a policy that we all agree on and that we can support moving forward. Because the reality is that even though we have continued to make our voter registration system more accessible, we've automated it at the motor vehicle division. We've created online voter registration where your registration must be validated through the motor vehicle division. There are still folks out there, for whatever reason, who are not getting on the rolls or who have errors in their voter registration, and when they go to vote on election day and they are citizens, they are not, they're showing up as not eligible to vote. Unfortunately, I can't support a proof of citizenship piece of legislation, because at the end of the day, the federal courts have already said that that is unconstitutional in the two places where they do it currently, which is Kansas and Arizona. The secretaries of state there tried to do that. And so moving forward, we have to continue to rely on other data that we have to verify that these are eligible voters moving forward, which we currently do. Again, we verify voter registration through the motor vehicle division. We compare data with other states. We are able to remove deceased voters from the rolls because we get a monthly update as to those who have become deceased from the Social Security Administration. So we have a lot of technology available for us to do this in a safe, secure way that allows every single eligible citizen who wants to cast a ballot on election day to be able to get registered and to vote. And I'm fully in support of any legislation that will get us there or even close to there moving forward.
Thank you.
Could I have an extra 20 seconds, because the timer actually didn't start until the timer didn't start until she'd already been speaking for 20 seconds. I was watching the timer, it didn't start.
We actually went over on the last question, actually. So when you were answering. So,
yeah, I'm just watching the timer. I just want, if we're trying to stick to 90 seconds, I'd like everybody to stick to 90 seconds as best as possible.
Yes, okay.
And she had an extra 20 seconds on that answer.
You could have
very quickly, please.
Oh yeah, I mean the issue about we have an existing system that allows people to be removed. The clerk has to go through and do that if they are deceased from a state. Not all the because not all the states participate in the ERIC system. But one of the things that we don't have is we have not been able to clean out people who've been dead for years. You know, yes, we get notification all the time, but we need to go through and make sure that we don't have zombies who are still on the rolls.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're going to move on to question 6 now. And we begin with Mrs. Greider on question 6. And it is, what will you do to make political contributions to campaigns more transparent?
Well, I think that the law is sufficient where that is concerned. It's a very good reporting system. So I don't anticipate making any changes. The Secretary of State is an administrative, and it would be my intention to keep it administrative.
Okay. Ms. Oliver, your response to that on making political contributions to campaigns more transparent.
So when I came into the Secretary of State's office about a year and 10 months ago, one of the challenges that we had with enforcing campaign finance reporting in the state was that we'd had huge chunks of our current state law gutted by the Citizens United decision and other decisions, and so it was unenforceable. The legislature also gave the Secretary of State power to make rules with regard to how those laws should be carried forward. And so working together with a variety of advocacy organizations and with our own internal legal counsel, we drafted a rule to provide clarity. And so now, particularly when outside dark money interests come in to invest in campaigns in the state, those are now required to be disclosed to the public so that we as the voters know who is paying for the glossy mailers that come to our mailboxes and the ads that we see on TV, when that was an unenforceable law prior to the rule. Moving forward, the thing that I'm most focused on, of course, there are some additional legislative fixes that would make it easier to enforce and administer the Campaign Reporting Act. But we have just received funding from the legislature to completely revamp the Campaign Finance Information System, which is the online database where we have all of the campaign finance reports that are filed. Moving forward, we're going to create a state-of-the-art system that's robust, full of information, provides analysis for voters and citizens and the media to be able to understand who is investing in our candidates and campaigns, and how can we better understand what interests are at play in the lawmakers' arena moving forward.
Okay, Dr. Clarkson.
Well, I'm all for transparency in our election systems, but one of the things that, again, is very important, the Secretary of State doesn't get to make the law. The Secretary of State's job is to enforce the law as passed by the legislature. And once again, just as we had with straight party voting, we have another problem, and I'm sure the Supreme Court will be dealing with this before the election, and that is that the legislature did not successfully make a law that dealt with independent expenditures. And unfortunately, certain officials decided to go ahead and make law on their own, unconstitutionally so, and it's impressive when you can violate both the federal Constitution and the state Constitution simultaneously. So I anticipate we'll be back before the Supreme Court fairly soon to deal with that issue. In terms of dark money, it's interesting. The last two elections, there's been a lot of discussion about movement of money between PACs and trying to play a shell game and move it around. You know, and people were identifying George Soros as somebody else's political sugar daddy. I want to make sure that whatever the law is, that law is enforced. So the Secretary of State's job is not to make the law. That's up to the legislature. If the Secretary of State wants to make law, as they said at the Supreme Court last week, they should resign and run for the legislature. Our job, when I'm Secretary of State, I will do whatever the legislature passes as the law. That's going to be my job. My job is not to make up new law. The Constitution gives the power to the legislature. Whatever the legislature delegates to the Secretary of State, they have. Whatever they don't, the Secretary can't act.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver, question 7. The Secretary of State's office registers corporations. How can this be done efficiently and with an eye to preventing fraud and undue influence by those corporations?
So when I came into the Secretary of State's office, the Business Services Division was kind of struggling with making sure that we were getting business registrations in and turned around in a timely manner. I'm proud to say that we are now into a one-day, next-day turnaround time. So when a business is filed with the Secretary of State's office, either online or through the mail or through paperwork that's handed in over the counter, we are getting those businesses filed and created and up and running so those businesses can go out into the community and do what they do best, which is to conduct their business, to hire New Mexicans, to be able to further our economy here in New Mexico. What I want to continue doing is not only making customer service our #1 priority and keeping those businesses at the forefront and making sure that they have all the tools and resources that they need to get up and running, but also to expand our online filing system. Right now, only LLCs can be filed online. We are looking to expanding to ensure that other types of corporations and nonprofit entities can also file online. file their reports online, make their payments for their annual fees online. This is just another way that we can help make it easier. I also want to work together with the next administration to really expand the one-stop business portal here in New Mexico. This was a bill that was passed several years ago that was supposed to be a one-stop shop for businesses to make it easier to get up and running and know everything they need to know. Right now it's just a website with a bunch of links, and I'm hoping that with the next administration, I and my staff can work to make it a fully integrated website that can truly be a resource for businesses.
Thank you. Dr. Clarkson, same question.
Well, yes, and this is one of the really important things. Most people have always assumed that historically the Secretary of State has just been a county clerk on steroids. Whereas since 2013, the corporate formation function moved from the PRC over to the Secretary of State. So that's a reasonably new function, and so most people have not historically thought of the Secretary of State as having a function of job creation. And that's in fact one of the main reasons I'm running. We have a huge problem here in New Mexico. Forbes magazine lists us as number 47 in terms of the worst state to do business, and it's because we're heavily overregulated. And so one of the things that I would like to do with Secretary of State, in addition to making sure that we're maximally efficient in corporate formation and also with the secure transactions filings, because every time a small business owner goes out to get an equipment loan or use any sort of collateralized loan, they have to route paperwork through the Secretary of State's office. We need to make sure that we are creating jobs here in New Mexico. And this is something where I think this will be the first time where hopefully we'll have a campaign discussing job creation. Most of my students in New Mexico State, when they graduate, they leave the state. 95% of my students leave because they can't get a job here. So the vision of a New Mexico that I have for the Secretary of State is we raise up our kids, we send them off to school, they go to trade school or they go to college, either one, but then they come back here and they raise their families here, they get good paying jobs here, and we can watch our grandchildren play Little League on the weekends. That's a nonpartisan vision that all New Mexicans can share.
Thank you. Ms. Greider.
Yes, ma'am. Could you repeat the question again?
Of course.
At the end of the line.
The Secretary of State's office registers corporations. How can this be done efficiently and with an eye to preventing fraud and undue influence by those corporations?
Thank you for repeating that. Well, I think that making it easier and more accessible, like having an online where the corporations can go and learn what they need to do to become registered with the state. Job creation for New Mexico is a very exciting topic because unfortunately we are a little economically depressed as a state and would love to see that turn around any way, shape, form, or fashion we can make that happen. So anything that makes that easier for anyone, whether that is an out-of-state or someone in the state saying, oh, I want to start a corporation or a small business or anything, job creation is just imperative for our state. And I think entrepreneurship is an exciting thing. I think everyone should be an entrepreneur. So, as being one of the past 24 years with my husband owning a company in the state of New Mexico, it's a great place to work and live and do business. And so anything that would make it easier for them to be able to come, of course, be honest about why they're coming and what they're doing here, and bring jobs to New Mexicans.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Clarkson, is cybersecurity an important issue in New Mexico elections? What will you do to prevent hacking of and tampering with voting systems?
Cybersecurity is critically important. And this goes back to this common theme that we need to have New Mexican voters believe that the elections are fair, that they are done efficiently, that they're done properly, and that every vote counts. So I've been on numerous cybersecurity committees. I'm a former computer science professor, so I have a cybersecurity background. It's clearly an expertise that I plan to bring to the Secretary of State's office. But again, as I said earlier, hack-proof is not the same thing as fraud-proof. We can make sure that the machines are reasonably and effectively protected from outside hacking. That does nothing to do to address the problem of if the underlying data is flawed, if we haven't bothered to verify that empty lots that have 39 people registered at that empty lot aren't in fact living there and therefore shouldn't be on the voter rolls. No amount of cybersecurity is going to solve that problem. And this goes back to this core problem that too many New Mexicans do not believe that our elections are fair. The effort to ram straight party voting down their throats was something that made a lot of people feel like the people were trying to rig the election right before the election for partisan advantage. And the Secretary of State shouldn't do that. The Secretary of State's job is to enforce the law and make sure that every voter feels like their vote counts. They don't want people damaging the power of their vote by voting when they shouldn't be.
Mrs. Greider.
I believe that cybersecurity is very important, and I believe that election fraud is an awful thing. And like I said before, I had the opportunity to observe the recount. In the smaller counties, there was some little discrepancies, but none of this involved cybersecurity, so did not get to observe that firsthand. I have been excited about the positive side of electronic voting, which would not be cybersecurity, but electronic voting. And I think that maybe we could turn the negative into a positive and maybe look at ways where we could securely electronically vote through a blockchain-like technology where it is unhackable or as unhackable as anyone has managed to make it so far, and thus ensure our elections are safe and accurate and only done by one person one time, and you absolutely have to be alive to access it. So that's something I'm interested in.
Ms. Oliver.
As I mentioned before, I've been critically focused on security of our election systems, not just since I came to the Secretary of State's office, but of course in my time as county clerk in Bernalillo County, because we always have to be concerned that there are nefarious external actors that are trying to tamper with our elections, make changes to our voter registration system, et cetera. So not only do we now have a secure election system here in New Mexico, which I'm very proud of, which my office and the county clerks have been working together to create, as well as creating a very strong and robust partnership with the federal government. The Department of Homeland Security has been a wonderful partner, working together with me and my staff and our county clerks to make every single tool and resource that they have available. I receive regular classified briefings from the federal government about any potential threats. I sit on the DHS Government Coordinating Council, working together with secretaries of state and clerks from around the country to make sure that we are ensuring that all of those resources are going where they need to go into the Secretary of State's and county clerks' offices. But beyond that, we have a resilient system here in New Mexico. We foresaw this long before we knew that Russia was going to interfere with our election in 2016. That's why we have an all-paper ballot system, and we have mandatory post-election audits to make sure that our machines and our systems were not tampered with during an election after every single election, and the voters can have faith and trust that their votes were counted as cast.
Thank you. Ms. Greider. Question 9. Is funding adequate to carry out the many duties of the Secretary of State's office? What areas need more funding and why?
Well, I believe that the funding is sufficient. I believe that our government is sufficiently funded on all levels, and that we need to do a better job of being stewards of the money that the people of New Mexico have entrusted the government with, and do the very best job in making sure that it's being spent wisely and efficiently. There is too much bureaucracy in all levels of government, and I'm sure at the Secretary of State's office, like all others, and that probably just a good audit and housekeeping is in order to make sure that everything is being distributed fairly and equitably and being used to the best of its advantage.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Oliver.
Well, both I and the two secretaries of state prior to me have continually advocated to the legislature that the Secretary of State's office is under budgeted and underfunded. And this last year I had to go before the legislature and explain that elections are not an emergency that deserve to be funded haphazardly and piecemeal, as it has been done year after year, that there is a regular cost to conducting elections in the state of New Mexico, that it is what it is, that it doesn't change very much between elections, and that furthermore, there are so many things that we can, should, and want to do that we are unable to do. Of course, the state was in dire fiscal straits for the last several years, and it was very hard. The legislature had to make very difficult decisions about which agencies that they were going to fund and how they were going to do it. So in this next legislative session, we have asked for full funding for the office. We've been carrying about a 30% vacancy rate, which means that about 3 out of every 10 of our positions in the office have been unfunded for years. We need those staff in order to be able to do to carry out the functions of the office, to serve the voters and citizens and business owners of the state. So the funding that I've asked for will go to making sure the office is sufficiently staffed. Again, as I mentioned previously, to providing better voter education opportunities, and also to make sure that the security of our systems is sound moving forward, because election security is a marathon without a finish line. That is a project that will be ongoing for years and years to come to make sure our elections are safe.
Thank you. Dr. Clarkson.
Yes, ma'am. Well, one of the things that would be interesting to find out is what is the budget's adequacy once we stop wasting money on partisan games. Unfortunately, we've had when the Pierce campaign successfully was able to win in court and uphold First Amendment freedoms. It cost the state $133,000 because of bad legal advice from the Attorney General and bad decision making in going after partisan errands or partisan aims. So if we eliminated that stupid partisan move, we'd save $133,000. That's quite a large chunk of the budget. If we still are tallying, and my campaign just filed an IPRA request today to try and find out what is the cost associated to both Secretary of State and the counties for doing all of this nonsense with straight party voting. Apparently, there were initiatives moving forward without even waiting for the Supreme Court to rule. So again, it's one thing to say, gee, we need more money. Well, how about stop wasting money first before you start asking for more money? You ought to be a good steward of the resources you've been given before you start asking for more. And then, obviously we'll find out, if there's yet another challenge. Based on what the Supreme Court said this week, I anticipate there'll be at least one more challenge. And once again, we will find out that the Secretary of State's office has wasted taxpayer money for purely partisan reasons, and that's just wrong.
Thank you.
We move on now. Ms. Oliver, what can the Secretary of State's office do to expedite the filing of paperwork from both individuals and corporations?
Could I ask a clarifying question, please? Are we talking about the Business Services Division?
That would involve corporate paperwork.
Okay.
The individual paperwork could also apply to other divisions of the Secretary of State's office.
Well, so right now in business services, we are at a same day, next day turnaround time. It's a little bit harder to have a faster time than that, and we intend to keep it that way. We've gotten it that way through a series of changes focused on making sure that we have robust customer service and that we are focusing on making sure that those filings get turned around quickly so that businesses can get to work. They can get up and running. They can do what they need to do to create jobs. There are a wide variety of other filings, one of which the Secretary of State's office deals with in anticipation of every general election or every primary election, actually, which are the filings that consist of candidates coming to file for office and often turning in petition signatures. One of the things that I'm looking toward asking the legislature to do in the next session would be to create an online petition signature system such that we can verify petition signatures right off the bat once a petition is signed, so that we don't have to go through costly and time-consuming litigation on the back end, and candidates are not removed from the ballot over technicalities of headers and things like that. So that's one of the ways in which we can actually really make a difference, I think, moving forward in terms of a very specific area of filing.
Okay, Dr. Clarkson.
Well, one of the things we obviously need to do is trying to use information technology to make the process as efficient as possible. And so I agree that where we can do as much online filing as possible, that's better. The more time where you can have the original data be coming from the keyboard of the filer directly into the database Secretary of State with appropriate cybersecurity safeguards in place, the faster and the more efficient it is for everybody. But one of the things that we also, I will be advocating for as Secretary of State, since we are going to be getting reports from every small business and every corporation that does business in New Mexico, one of the things we can do is we can start asking people, well, what would be good, what can we do to make things better in New Mexico? We're at number 47 in terms of the worst possible environment to do business. I mean, it's a bad thing when your state motto is thank God for Mississippi. So we need to be able to figure out how to do better. And one of the things, since the Secretary of State interacts with every corporation in the state, one of the things I would propose to do would be to do an advisory regulatory audit to ask all these businesses, What are the regulations that are interfering with your ability to create jobs in New Mexico? Why is it that we have businesses that just choose not to set up shop in New Mexico? In the oil patch in the southeast, they set up shop just across the state border in Texas because they say that New Mexico is just too difficult to do business in. And when we get to also in terms of the individuals, we obviously there was an issue in CD2 this last time where somebody got kicked off the ballot because they had a tilde in their last name. And I can assure all the viewers, I will never disenfranchise or kick somebody off the ballot for having a tilde in their last name.
Mrs. Greider.
Thank you. All very good answers given by both candidates, and I agree with both of them. Online filing, I don't think that we can get better than next day service, so very good job. I think that's wonderful. And interviewing and asking questions on the people who actually have to interface with the system and how that would make it a better way to be utilized, I think is also awesome. So they both provided wonderful answers that are also mine.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Clarkson.
Yes, ma'am.
Question 11. How will you maintain transparency and honesty in the many different transactions of the Secretary of State's office?
Well, I think it's critically important that we have transparency throughout the office because right now there are people who just do not believe that the Secretary of State gives people fair shake. Whether they're being disenfranchised or kicked off the ballot for having a tilde in their last name, whether they are, we have a situation where a Supreme Court justice of one party was told by the Secretary of State that they're not eligible for public funding. But magically, as soon as their opponent from another party got on the ballot, they magically were able to access public funding. That kind of partisan gamesmanship is just wrong. We need to make sure that the Secretary of State applies the rules fairly across the board. And I think one of the Supreme Court justices said it really well at oral argument, is that we shouldn't have the Secretary of State determining the outcome of elections. The election should be the same irrespective of the party affiliation or who's in office as Secretary of State. And I think that was one of the biggest smackdowns the Supreme Court delivered during the oral argument, was simply that the Secretary of State needs to stop being a partisan shop. It needs to be a shop where everybody believes that things are done fairly, and transparency is a huge part of that. We need to find out how much money George Soros has been pumping into various different candidates here in the state. That's something that, that's an important thing. And yet we have people who are playing a shell game with different political action committees. And I think that's just wrong. We need to have transparency. We can talk about dark money, but there's a lot of introspection that needs to happen.
Thank you. Ms. Greider.
Yes. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. How will you maintain transparency and honesty in the many different transactions of the Secretary of State's office?
I believe that transparency to the citizens is absolutely one of the most important roles in all offices. The Secretary of State especially, because we are the guardian of the electoral process. And so in all ways possible, campaign finance, of course, in every way being accountable to the voters and saying, where did this come from? Who is it going to? And that there should be no hindrance there. We also need to be mindful of our First Amendment rights, and not violating those. So it's a fine line, but it needs to be walked carefully and always err on the side of the citizenry. It is the citizens of New Mexico's government. It is our job as Secretary of State to guard that for the citizens in all areas and to be vigilant in that at all times.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Oliver.
Well, I have a deep and abiding commitment to transparency and fairness, and that has been demonstrated through my now almost 12-year career in public service here in New Mexico. If you look at my record, these decisions that have to be made by county clerks, that have to be made by secretaries of state, due to the inherent nature of politics, can be perceived as partisan. The reality is that the Secretary of State and county clerks are charged with following the law, and when and where the law itself is inherently unfair, we can work together with the legislature to make changes. Or in the case of the campaign finance rule that I was able to promulgate last year, we know that citizens want transparency in campaign finance disclosures. We know that the state languished in the dark for over 7 years after the Citizens United decision because voters were deprived of having that critical information available to them about who was coming into the state and spending money to help affect the outcomes of campaigns. That's why I use the power given to me by the legislature to write the campaign finance rule that requires that transparency. Not only that, it provided clarification for candidates and campaigns about how they can spend their money and how they report their money in terms of what they're raising and spending in the political arena as well. So my record of commitment to transparency and to fairness is demonstrable over a 12-year career in public service, and I will continue to carry that forward in everything that we do in the Secretary of State's office.
Thank you.
Thank you. We continue now with question 12, and we'll begin with Mrs. Greider on this one. What do you consider to be the biggest opportunity or challenge facing you if you are elected, and how will you deal with it?
I think that the biggest opportunity would be the ability to educate the citizens of New Mexico and bring them into the process and make them more comfortable so that they do have faith in their elections, so they do have faith that their vote's going to count, because that is the biggest obstacle. That is where I find when I am speaking with people on a day-to-day basis, they're just like, it doesn't matter. I don't vote, and I'm not going to vote, and I hate politics, and it's gross, and I don't want to talk about it. And I don't want that to be the way. I mean, citizens should be excited about politics, not grossed out by it. It shouldn't be something that makes them uneasy. But it should be very much like their day-to-day lives. When I ask them, when you go to your neighbor, do you have these arguments over your mailbox? And they say no. And I said, well, that's the reality of our lives, and our political process should be very much like that, how we interact kindly with each other and rationally with each other. And so that's my greatest challenge, and my greatest excitement is to be able to do that and bring that positiveness and unity and education and togetherness like we all should be as New Mexicans and Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver.
Could you please repeat the question?
Sure, absolutely. What do you consider to be the biggest opportunity or challenge facing you if elected, and how will you deal with it?
I think the biggest opportunity is also the biggest challenge moving forward. Here in New Mexico, due to the really great work of the legislature, county clerks, and past secretaries of state, we have actually an amazing election system here in this state. We are a model for many other states in the country in terms of how we provide access to voters, in terms of how we protect the safety and security of our elections, in terms of how we ensure that votes are counted as cast. But moving forward, there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's the reason why I'm running again for Secretary of State this time around, because 2 years wasn't enough time to get all the work done that I'm hoping to do. And in that time, I'm hoping to continue to expand access to the ballot box, to continue to make it easier and efficient for voters to get on the voting rolls, to know who is on their ballot, what, where, and when they can cast their ballot, and to continue to just expand access more generally. And that's a challenge because there are unfortunately some folks who would like to see voting rights moved back in this country, and we've seen it happening across the country for the past decade, 20 years. We've seen strict photo voter ID laws imposed. We've seen early voting opportunities rolled back. We have an opportunity to continue to lead the nation in terms of both access and security and modernity of our election system, and I want to keep our state moving forward, not backward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Clarkson, I'll repeat the question because it really is a two-part question. What do you consider to be the biggest opportunity or challenge facing you if elected, and how would you deal with it?
Well, the biggest challenge is obviously job creation. These are new functions for the Secretary of State, and so we need to figure out how to get the Secretary of State to be a participant. And by the way, government doesn't create jobs. Government needs to get out of the way so that small business can create jobs. So trying to figure out how to change the mindset about people that think that the Secretary of State is just a county clerk on steroids, when in fact they have a major opportunity to contribute to job creation, is going to be a big challenge. The biggest opportunity, I think, is to restore faith in the office. I fundamentally disagree that the Secretary of State has ability to promulgate rules where the legislature failed to pass a law. And I think the Supreme Court made that very clear this last week, and I anticipate they'll probably revisit the issue again. And just as was the case with straight party voting, the Supreme Court pointed out that as implemented, the straight party voting would lead to really, really bad outcomes. And we have the same problem here with the disclosure rule, in that, you know, if you're a grandmother and you're giving money to a cause that a certain politician disagrees with, they want to out you, post your home phone number, home address, you put your name out there, maybe not your home phone number, but they want to make sure that Antifa knows where you live so they can camp out on your lawn and protest you because you gave to a group that they disagree with. And I think that level of hostility, the Supreme Court has said, is a serious concern. Citizens United talked about it. So I believe that that rule has violated not only the state constitution, but also the federal constitution. It's an impressive move to violate two constitutions at once.
The candidates for New Mexico Secretary of State, incumbent Democrat Maggie Toulouse Oliver, thank you for being with us today very much. Thank you, Dr. Gavin Clarkson, the Republican candidate, and thank you as well to Libertarian Ginger Grider. We appreciate your candidacies, your opportunity that you've taken here today to share your positions on the issues in a fair and complete forum on a variety of issues affecting the state of New Mexico and the Secretary of State's office. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greater Las Cruces, we would like to thank you for your time, for your effort in getting here, and for your participation. We again thank KRWG for hosting and inviting us to be a collaborative member of this community. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and we thank you at the League for being a partner with us. We want to remind people that you have until October 9th to register to vote. And if you have a state-issued ID, like a driver's license, and you're not sure if you're registered or not, you'll find at the bottom right of krwg.org a link to register online. It's a link to the Secretary of State's office, and you can see your registration status by going to that link. Again, it's at the bottom right of krwg.org. If you have a state-issued ID, like a driver's license, you can use that service. Otherwise, register at your county clerk's office. Thanks so much for being with us.